Hello everyone and welcome back into another edition of the GSMC Dead Ball Sports Podcast, brought to you as always by the GSMC Sports Network. My name as your host is Christopher Shepard. Thank you all for tuning in on another chilly Thursday afternoon here in the tri-state area. But for today's show, we have a great one ahead, talking a little bit all things football here, mixed in with the first ever hockey segment as well. We'll be talking about, of course, the Jets' hiring of Aaron Glenn and the impact it will have on both the Jets and the Lions, now down two of their best coaching minds and coordinators. We're looking at the All-Rookie and All-America offenses that ESPN just released and analyzing those as well. A lot of interesting players and storylines to look at there. We're going to be, of course, going to have to recap that Texans-Chiefs game, even though a lot of people are mad at it still. But it's the last divisional round recap we are going to do here on the show. And then for our first ever hockey segment, we want to do a nice little power rankings, assess the state of the NHL as it reaches its midway point, and look at some of the top Stanley Cup contenders along the way. But as always, before we get into any of that fun stuff, I do want to remind you, as always, to like, follow, and subscribe to the show if you want to keep up with all of our content, not just from my show as well, but around the network, all the shows happening around here. But if you do want to contribute, interact with our show a little bit more directly while we are live streaming, consider making yourselves available to the Super Chat, Super Thanks, and Super Stickers features here on YouTube. As always, a great way to get your opinions, your input, your feedback on air. You can also do it through our website, gsmcsportsnetwork.net. It is generally appreciated by all concerned here at the network, and it just makes our shows that much better. We truly thank you for all you do. But without further ado, let us jump into our first segment of the day, talking about that final divisional round game left to talk about, the Texans-Chiefs game. And I know a lot of people might want to talk about it. They're still fuming about the outcome of this one, but it's still necessary to talk about, as the Chiefs are a team that are a force to be reckoned with, and they've just proved it time and time again. And that was the difference in this one against a Houston team that didn't play all that terribly, but made too many countless errors, both in the red zone, on special teams, what have you, to stay in this one at Arrowhead. But ultimately, I do think that this win cemented the Chiefs as a team that no matter what happens, always feel like they got a shot. It's going to be a good one at Arrowhead on Sunday, yet again against the Bills. And let's break down the outcome of this one. The Chiefs did run out 23-14 winners, but I want to talk about some key players, some key moments as always, and further analyze this one. So without further ado, let's jump right into it, starting off with the magic of the Chiefs. No matter what happens, come postseason time, the Chiefs lock in, and all their players become these supernatural powerhouses who just annihilate teams no matter what, and they don't care about the final scoreline, right? This 23-14 scoreline sure looks a lot closer than you might think, but this was a true and utter annihilation. And yes, you can say the Texans were very much in this game late in the fourth quarter, but because of the potency of this Chiefs defense combined with the efficiency of the Chiefs offense in those clutch situations, it was just too much for Houston to overcome. And this was a Houston team, remember, that yes, got a unexpected win in the wild card round at home against LA, but really have not played very well against elite teams this year, and really have looked more like paper tigers than the Super Bowl contenders we thought they were going to be. So it was more of that Houston vibe than the one that we saw in Los Angeles. But that does not mean that this Houston team did not play an overall pretty solid game. Let's talk about the Chiefs first and foremost. Let's talk about how effective someone like a Travis Kelce is. 7 receptions, 117 yards, 1 touchdown. He's putting up Jerry Rice-like numbers, only second to him in terms of postseason receiving yards, receptions, and what have you. He is just someone who elevates his game, no matter how his regular season went, for the big stages. And in this one, I ultimately believe he was the difference. He was just able to exploit this Texans defense over the middle, not necessarily going up against the solid cover corners that they have in Derek Stingley and Kamari Lassiter, and really opening up many different avenues for Patrick Mahomes as kind of a safety blanket. And so that's what makes a huge difference if you're the Chiefs in the postseason. Having a player like Travis Kelce, who has the playoff experience, the playoff knowledge, and ultimately that connection with Mahomes to really understand what it takes to perform on the big stage. And that's what they do time and time again, no matter the opponent, no matter the nature of the game, no matter the flow of the game, they always seem to connect at the most important moments. And that crazy touchdown ultimately was the difference, right? To one where Mahomes was nearly going to get sacked, then he flings it to Travis in the back of the end zone, and that was the ball game. So something that a lot of teams are going to have to try and figure out, because you don't want a guy like Travis Kelce getting going if you're Buffalo or Washington or Philly once they get to the Super Bowl, if they get to the Super Bowl, because that connection is almost more than enough to frustrate a team, because you do the best that you can do on the outside, and the Texans are one of the best teams in playing man-to-man on the outside with their guys in Stingley and Lassiter. They really, I thought, did an effective enough job to slow down guys like Worthy and Hopkins, but you have to account for Travis Kelce's intelligence. He may not be the fastest anymore. He may not be the strongest, but he's still savvy, and he still is Mahomes' favorite weapon. So any opponent the Chiefs face from here on out in the postseason, not just this year, but many years to come, because if you know they're going to be here always, you have to account for Patrick Mahomes and Travis Kelce. Or, once Kelce retires, another weapon that steps up for the Chiefs as well. But then, in terms of the Chiefs' defense, that's where I feel like Houston could have done a bit better in preparing for this game. I feel like Steve Spagnuolo really understood the assignment. I think he really understood that if you put pressure on this Texans offensive line, they'll break. And so I feel like he was able to do an effective job of bringing out the best, not just of these edge rushers, but in the interior. And that's the reason why I think George Karlaftis had such a good game. 3 of their 8 sacks, including some very vital ones down the stretch in the fourth quarter. And I do think that going up against the Bills, it's going to be a tougher task, because the Bills are going to want to implement the running game a little bit more than, say, the Texans were able to. So look for the interior of this Chiefs defensive line to really be the X factor in whether or not they can ultimately get to the Super Bowl and win it. Because that game plan by Steve Spagnuolo was pure postseason tactical understanding. It's the game plan of someone who's been in the situation before and understands what he needs from his defensive unit. And then ultimately combine that with the complementary nature of this offense that was just able to produce enough, and it really frustrated this Texans team. So ultimately, congratulations to the Chiefs, even though there are going to be many discussions and debates to come over whether or not they had calls go their way in this one and for the rest of the postseason. I'm not willing to indulge in that. It's just the fact that they are a team that finds ways to win, and that's all you need to do in the postseason, no matter how you do it. And the Texans side of things, like I said, this wasn't necessarily a terrible game from them. I thought CJ Stroud played pretty well for how much the Chiefs were really pressuring and blitzing him. He was 19-28, 245 yards. He made some timely throws, but ultimately the problems arose in the red zone. Ultimately, when the offensive line started to weaken, ultimately where special teams failures really happened, with Ka'imi Fairbairn missing those couple field goals, and then where most of CJ Stroud's most heartbreaking, embarrassing sacks took place, because right then and there in the fourth quarter, Houston was making this a game. It was theirs to be had, really, if they could just march on the field and put it in the end zone. And they got to the red zone. They were able to sustain a couple drives, but ultimately Stroud and this offensive line struggled to punch it in. And then you look at the lack of a run game, really, after a certain point. Joe Mixon did have a decent game, but even in the fourth quarter, when critical moments, you expected more out of him after he had such a good first half. But ultimately, the moral of this game for Houston is that you can't go into next season not knowing the status of your offensive line. They've had a lot of shuffling around to do. They've had a lot of different guys go in, go out, but no kind of cohesion, no cohesiveness to really build a foundation on for next year. That's the reason why they regressed to the mean a little bit this year as well. They really could not protect Stroud. He got sacked way more than his rookie year, and ultimately saw his own numbers decline as a result. And also as a result, Joe Mixon, who looked really promising at the start of the year, saw his numbers decline as the year went on, and lack of trust in the run game ultimately led to stagnation in the pass game as well. And those injuries to Stephon Diggs and Tank Dell didn't help out either. So I really think there are going to be a lot of questions asked of this offensive line. They have to be answered immediately, or else this Texans team is not going to fulfill the dreams they had in Stroud's rookie season when they were really thinking of being true Super Bowl contenders in the AFC. Right now, the only team in NFL history, and yes, they're one of the newest, but still the only team in NFL history to not reach a championship game. And in order to do that, you have to build the trenches. And they did it very well at their defensive line. I thought they played very well in this game as well. But that offensive line is the difference between them and the AFC's elite. And if you want to beat teams like the Chiefs, especially on the road, you have to match them toe-to-toe, and it comes in the trenches because they've got you beat in most areas in that regard. That defensive line immediately clears this Texans offensive line. So if you want that to be compensated for, you're going to have to go out in free agency, the draft, and find your guys. But other than that, it really was a pretty solid effort for what we thought they were going to look like coming into this game, but ultimately not enough on the road at Arrowhead against this Chiefs team. So make of it what you will. I'm not going to indulge all those bad calls that people are debating about, but still, it's an interesting game that I really wanted to touch upon as my last game of the week. Let me know what you think in the comments, because coming next, we're going to be assessing ESPN's all-rookie team on the offensive side of the football. Maybe we get to talk with the defenses as well, but it should be an interesting segment looking at all these astonishing rookies on the offensive side of the football this season, especially in light of the AP, finalists for all these NFL awards coming out today. So it should be a good one. We'll be right back after this short break to talk about it.
I feel like I'm losing my mind. Is everybody in the world blind? Please, Lord, give me a sign, a sign. I feel like I'm losing my mind. Is everybody in the world blind? Please, Lord, give me a sign, a sign.
I wanna be the greatest. Everybody on the fake shit. I look around and feel like everybody is the fakest. I make this every day and I'm impatient, hoping one day I blow up from the basement. Statement, the top is so vacant. I don't hear shit that I think is amazing. Waiting for my day when I'm playing sold out shows for 1,000 faces. Hey, give me that crown, get in my way and to be put down. It ain't your place, all this my town. If I want that shit, then I'll get it right now. I'm losing it, the noose it fits. I'm losing shit, a stupid myth. You choose to live or choose to dip. You choose to fight or lose your grip and lose a gift.
I feel like I'm losing my mind. Is everybody in the world blind? Please, Lord, give me a sign, a sign. I feel like I'm losing my mind.
Hello everyone and welcome back into the GSMC Dead Ball Sports Podcast, brought to you as always by the GSMC Sports Network. Before we get into our second segment of today's show, I want to remind you, as always, to continue making yourselves available to the Super Chat, Super Thanks, and Super Stickers features here on YouTube. As always, a great way to get your opinions and input and feedback out there. You can do it through our website as well, gsmcspodcast.net. You can do a question, comment, or concern you have with the show, a tip or donation, what have you. Anything is genuinely appreciated by the shows around the network and us as well, but also just makes our shows that much better and more interactive. Without further ado, let's get into our second segment today. Like I said, we're going to be talking about two different teams that ESPN just released. First and foremost, the all-rookie team in the NFL, one of the best classes in recent memory in NFL history, this 2024 class. A little bit of a preview there. I just want to talk about this team. I really think that a lot of fans can be apprehensive and skeptical about this team, but I do think it represents a lot of where these different franchises are building towards or already have in terms of the foundation. Obviously, we all know who the QB is, and we all know what he's doing right now. But all these other guys, how these franchises really got to where they are and made the decision to draft them and made the decision to build their teams around them. And while most of these guys on these teams aren't going to be anywhere near the playoffs for quite some time, it's still interesting to think about and imagine a world where we get to see a lot of these names grow into being some of the best of their respective positions. And so that's what makes this all-rookie team offense very interesting, because while these guys are on teams that didn't have a great season and they had a great season, they're just going to get better and better and hopefully be the reason why the impetus needed for their teams to reach higher heights, even though some of these guys already are doing incredible things, as suggested by the QBs. Without further ado, let's jump right into it. Obviously, everyone knows the QB is going to be on this team. It's Jayden Daniels. This is perhaps the most incredible rookie quarterback season we've ever seen. He's one win away from being the first ever rookie to start a Super Bowl in NFL history. But one of the most interesting stats that I found in ESPN's assessment of Jayden Daniels' season is this. We always talk about this young man's unflappable poise, command in the pocket, his calm, cool, collected nature. And this is the stat that I believe best exemplifies that. In the regular season, on fourth down, Jayden Daniels had a very, very impressive mark of a 92% conversion rate. That goes to show that not only are the Washington Commanders entrusting Jayden Daniels to make important decisions in critical moments, but that Jayden Daniels can deliver, unlike many other quarterbacks in the NFL. He's doing this at a better clip than a lot of teams. And they gave the Detroit Lions a taste of their own medicine with this formula. So that stat to me, even though he has so many impressive stats, one of the top leaders in completion percentage, passing yards this season, touchdown to interception ratio, that stat goes to show this is not a fluke, and the Commanders actually believe in what Jayden Daniels is doing. I'm sorry, I was thinking about C.J. Stroud last season, but Jayden Daniels, the reason why a lot of people are saying that this kid is going to be one of the greats over the next 10 years or so is because the Washington Commanders already believe of him as a great. They already are instilling this confidence in him to take them to the promised land. And now they're 2 wins away from their first Super Bowl appearance since '91. And it's not a fluke. And so that's why I feel like I had to present that stat to you, no matter how unimportant it may seem, to further hammer home the point that Jayden Daniels is already playing like a big-time NFL quarterback. It's the reason he's perhaps the best in terms of his play this postseason left in the playoffs this year. Even though you have Patrick Mahomes and Josh Allen on one side, he's playing Jalen Hurts, who has a myriad number of experience in these situations. So, seeing as to how Jayden Daniels is already playing like a all-pro quarterback, don't be surprised to see him reach greater heights than just an all-rookie team. He's going to be on an all-time team when all is said and done over the next 50 or so years when we look back at this class and these players. But I digress, even though I really would love to talk about Jaden Daniels as much as possible because we have other rookies to talk about on this team, and this is where we get kind of interesting. At the running back position, not really many rookies stood out except for one, and that is Bucky Irving. I think he had a really impressive season, seeing as to how on the Bucs it was looking like it was going to be a committee approach of both him, White, and then Tucker emerged later in the year. But Bucky Irving, here's an interesting stat in terms of the reason why he's the running back on this team. He's the only rookie running back to rush for more than 1,100 yards on fewer than 240 attempts. So it's quantity rather than quality that sees Bucky. And I'm not indicting his quality, because it's the reason why the Bucs offense was so diverse. It's the reason why Baker Mayfield was allowed to do a lot more things in this offense and himself led the league in touchdowns. It's because of what Bucky Irving opened up for him. And even in those moments where Mike Evans and Chris Godwin went down for a considerable amount of time, Bucky Irving really helped the Bucs in those situations. He carried a load in the absence of those two studs. And it speaks dividends that the Bucs were able to find him in the 5th, 6th round, because I feel like if you're a team like the Bucs, you know you're good enough to get into the postseason, but you need to find players in the latter stages of the draft to really supplement that, and you have to hit on them rather than just try and get a position of need and reach for a player. And this pick for them and Bucky Irving was almost the perfect situation, because they needed a guy in the backfield that could complement the high-powered offense with Baker, Mike Evans, and Chris Godwin. And it might have to be the case going forward, as Chris Godwin and Mike Evans are slated to hit free agency very soon, especially with Chris, because he's someone who, coming off that injury, is really going to be focused on understanding his future, especially in his career, and not just, whether or not he extends with the Bucs. So the fact that Bucky Irving emerged for a team like Tampa Bay is integral to their continued success, but also in terms of whether or not they can break through in the NFC and truly become a Super Bowl contender. So that's why I'm really excited to see a guy like Bucky Irving make this offense on ESPN's all-rookie team, because of the fact that Tampa is one of those teams who are on the precipice of something great, but need a player like Bucky to continue to perform in order to truly go over the cliff, if you know what I'm saying. But I do think that out of all the running backs of the rookie class, Bucky Irving was the standout one in my opinion. Now in terms of wide receivers, this is where it gets a little bit dicey, and a lot of fans will be up in arms, especially of a certain team here in the tri-state area with this one. But I do think that it's well warranted, well deserved for how this young man was playing as well, just because of the fact that when you look at the future of the Jacksonville Jaguars, you can see a situation where this young man becomes one of the league's best receivers and really helps a guy like Trevor Lawrence grow, and that is Brian Thomas Jr. This was a difficult year for him. It was a difficult year for Jacksonville because not a lot of things went right. Doug Peterson was just fired. They're still looking for a new head coach. We'll talk about that in the coming weeks. But Brian Thomas truly was a very nice bright spot for them. He had a 2.61 yard per route run with a combination of Lawrence and Jones. Not necessarily the best quarterbacks throwing to you, but you could also say that in the terms of the league neighbors, who also had various number of random quarterbacks throwing the football to him, you could also make the case that he should be here as well. But when you are someone for a team that really has a lot less control of their destiny than you think, and are slowly bursting at the seams. They now just fired as well GM Trent Baalke, and I believe they fired Shad Khan as well. But when you look at the Jacksonville Jaguars and how they operate, it's amazing that they were able to retain a player and address a need in the draft that could appeal to the future of this franchise, and not just its fans, but the head coach as well, because having a guy like Brian Thomas is going to be important for someone like Trevor Lawrence, who appreciates having that deep threat guy for him. So while Malik Nabers, in my opinion, had the better season at first glance, it's not, in my opinion, just about the first season, but how he progressed. And I think Brian Thomas Jr., if they get the head coaching position right, has a better chance to progress because he has a quarterback who's going to appreciate him a lot more. Whereas the Giants might be a little bit unsettled concerning how the draft might pan out for them. So this is not an indictment of Malik Nabers. He himself had a very incredible season with a lot of inconsistent quarterback play. But I just believe that Brian Thomas Jr. has more room to grow and improve and mature in this Jags offense, where he's going to be very appreciated. Whereas Malik Nabers still has some things to figure out in terms of who his quarterback might be. Then last but not least in this team, the tight end position, this one is easy as well. Mr. Brock Bowers broke the rookie record, obviously, set by Mike Ditka for most receiving yards by a tight end this season. No biggie. I think that Brock Bowers, out of all the receiving threats in this rookie class, truly was the most special one. I feel like he's going to be a difference maker for Las Vegas, no matter what happens, no matter what direction they take in the draft. But I do think that when you look at the landscape of the AFC West, they're not far behind if they can nail this offseason, if they can get the right head coach, if they can address their needs in the draft accordingly, and do well in free agency, maybe looking for a quarterback who could be a bridge option after potentially draft a guy in the 25 draft. Brock Bowers really has a chance to be something special outside of just this season. And that's why I think out of all these players, out of all these teams, Brock Bowers is going to be one of the most appealing players to monitor, whether it be from a fantasy perspective, from a real-life perspective, from a Raiders fan perspective, just because of how special he can be. So, overall, that is the all-rookie team offense for this 24 class. It has really been very impressive. But coming up next on the show, we transition to college football, looking at the All-American team, and that offense as well. Very good one as well, looking ahead to the future of the 2025 NFL Draft. We'll be right back after this short break.
Looking for your daily fix of sports talk without having to pay for it? GSMC Sports Network is available on YouTube. Just search GSMC Sports Network. Get your fix of daily sports talk shows on YouTube, absolutely free. NFL, college football, NBA, MLB, MMA, UFC, fantasy football, and so much more. GSMC Sports Network has shows running all day long, with new sports shows starting every 2 hours. Just like on your favorite cable sports channel, except GSMC Sports Network is absolutely free.
Hello everyone and welcome back in to the GSMC Dead Ball Sports Podcast, brought to you as always with the GSMC Sports Network. And for our third segment of today's show, we transition from the all-rookie team in the NFL this year to college football, discussing the All-American team offense in that regard and how impressive a lot of offensive players were in the college football season this year. And this offense truly was special. A lot of record-breaking players, a lot of players who are going to do great things in the NFL once they get drafted. But ultimately, I truly feel like when you look at the talent in this offense, this is one of the most diverse and intriguing All-American team offenses ESPN could have put together. And I'm really glad we get to appreciate some of the best players, some of the most underrated players, guys who we didn't think would even achieve their ultimate goals, but ultimately did. Some guys who might be playing at lower levels who you may not have heard of. But I do believe that This team is truly special, and no matter the futures of their careers, they'll always have this 2024 season to remember. So without further ado, let's jump right into this analysis of the All-American team that ESPN just put out, starting off at the QB position, potentially the number one overall pick in this year's draft. Cam Ward had a pretty incredible season. Ultimately, his Miami Hurricanes could not find their way into the playoffs. Their defense ultimately let them down, but Cam Ward certainly fulfilled a lot of promises at the QB position for this team. Quite a journey throughout his college football career did Cam Ward have. He was at Incarnate Word at the FCS level, one of their most prolific passers in their history, transferred to Washington State, had a very nice career there, and now coming to Miami, really concluding his college career with a bang. Third place in the Heisman Trophy race. Led the entire college football landscape in terms of passing touchdowns. He had 10 games with 300 plus passing yards. Miami school record with 4,313 passing yards. So he delivered on all fronts. Unfortunately, his team could not deliver for him in terms of getting him to the CFP, but truly fun to watch. I'm really excited to see how he transitions into the NFL, whether it be with any of the top 5 teams or, in a surprising situation where he might fall, but ultimately right now he is the number one QB in this class just for how incredible he is, especially in critical moments, because had he not had these illustrious games in his Miami career, they probably would not have won as many games as they did. Another important stat to note here is that he had 11 touchdowns that gave Miami the lead, so he truly is one of the more clutch quarterbacks in this 2025 class, but it's all going to depend on how scouts view him, how the teams at the top view him, but I truly think he could have a very special NFL career ahead of him. So congratulations, Cam Ward, for being named as the QB of ESPN's All-America team. Then in the running back position, this one was very easy. We have 2 running backs here, both of them very talented in their own right, but the RB1 for this All-American team is, of course, Mr. Ashton Jeanty. Perhaps one of, if not the best seasons from a running back in FBS history. Second, perhaps only to Barry Sanders in 1988 when he set the record for most rushing yards in a season, but he was not far off Ashton Jeanty. 2,601 rushing yards, 30 overall touchdowns, Heisman Trophy runner-up. He had 1,882 yards after contact. That is not a mess up. That is not a stat to be reckoned with lightly. I think that Ashton Jeanty truly is, in my opinion, the most special player from this college football season, just of his emergence, just because of how he put running backs at the college football level on the map and what he could potentially mean to an NFL team. A lot of people are saying he's going to look good in a Dallas Cowboys uniform. As much as I hate the Cowboys, I think that it would be a good fit. Ashton Jeanty, truly very special. Going to have to work on his stance. A lot of flack for that. But ultimately, he's going to have a very exciting NFL career. The sky's the limit for this kid. I think that, in my opinion, he would have been my Heisman Trophy winner. Nothing against Travis Hunter. I just think that the way he emerged this season was truly something incredible to behold. But I do think because of this next running back, he might have gotten held back a little bit, because having 2 remarkable running backs in this college football season does not necessarily help the better one's case on the Heisman Trophy level. And this next guy, the RB2 of this team, came 5th in Heisman Trophy voting himself. But I can't deny the fact that Ashton Jeanty's resilience throughout his career, his decision to stay with Boise State in his subsequent season, truly catapulted him into one of the great seasons and great players in college football history. But this next guy at the RB2 spot is certainly great in his own right, and will go down at the very least in Arizona State history as one of the most memorable, most prolific, most illustrious players in their history, and certainly put fear in my heart as a Texas Longhorns fan in the CFP quarterfinals, Mr. Cam Skattebo. And a guy who many people potentially may have never heard of before this season, but clearly proved why he's one of the country's most elite electric players in that CFP quarterfinal. He was only second to Genty this season in terms of yards from scrimmage, 1,711, 21 touchdowns. But talking about his stats in the CFP quarterfinal against my Texas Longhorns, 450 all-purpose yards. He passed for a touchdown. He ran for 2. He was a big receiving threat in that game as well, and truly proved that he's one of the better all-around players on the offensive side of the football in college football. And he's going to leave an indelible mark on Arizona State football, putting them on the map this season. Kanye Udo or whoever is now going to be the running back for Arizona State has big shoes to fill, because there's no replacing a guy like Cam Scadaboo and all the production he can give you. So, looking at these two running backs, it's tough to say which one impressed more. I mean, Ashton Genty, since he's a group of 5 player, probably got a little bit more time in the spotlight just because of his resurgence. But Cam Scadaboo, from going from a complete unknown to someone who left an indelible mark on a college football playoff, one of the best games of the 12-team era. Nothing's probably going to top that game in its first ever format. From being a true wrecking ball for Arizona State when they need him to be in critical moments throughout their season, I truly think that it was only right for ESPN to regard both of these players very highly. Now, moving on to the wide receiver position. I feel like this position just got amplified to the next level after the events of the CFP, but why not talk about Jeremiah Smith having a great all-around season for the Ohio State Buckeyes? Because a lot of people could say, well, a guy like Tyrone McMillan might be here, but Arizona State had a down year. And maybe Ryan Williams could be here, another electric freshman wide receiver. But no, I think that his first ever CFP appearance proved why Jeremiah Smith was one of, if not the best wide receivers of the year in CFP in his true freshman season. He had 4 touchdown catches for 290 yards in the first 2 playoff games, averaged 17.3 yards per catch in that regard. He had 1,315 yards or so in the regular season, had 15 touchdowns there as well, already put him in the top 5 in terms of Ohio State single-season records for receiving yards. And as the Rose Bowl MVP, as Kyle Leufert says, thank you for your comment, Kyle. And in terms of being named the Rose Bowl MVP, he truly set forth the status quo, the credo that Ohio State Buckeyes had just built for that game. Because much like Jackson Smith and Jigba in the Rose Bowl a couple of years ago, Jeremiah Smith left a stamp in this game with one of only 5 receivers to have over 185 plus receiving yards and 2 touchdowns in a college football game, playoff game, and ultimately cemented his status as one to watch for the next 2 years or so before he's eligible to get drafted, truly leaving an indelible mark on the college football season. One of the biggest catches of the college football season that cemented Ohio State's championship. So you really can't go wrong with a guy like Jeremiah Smith. But I don't necessarily think I put a graphic for this guy here. One guy I wanted to acknowledge, and I think ESPN did as well, at the wide receiver 2 spot, Nick Nash of San Jose State, a San Jose State lifer. Someone who you may have never heard of before the season, but truly needs to be given his flowers. Earned the receiving triple crown this year. That is the leader in terms of receptions, yards, and receiving touchdowns. He had 104 catches, 1,382 yards, and 16 total touchdowns. That's pretty remarkable for someone who plays for a school like San Jose State. Someone who stayed there his entire career, nevertheless. Not going to get much NFL buzz, but should be given his flowers for his college football career. Now let's talk about the tight end position, because I love this guy. A do-it-all player for the Penn State Nittany Lions. He's truly going to be missed by them next season. Mr. Tyler Warren. I love watching this kid play football because he just does a lot of crazy things, shows some crazy strength at the tight end position. Might not even be aligned as a tight end in certain places. He might be a halfback, might be a fullback, might even throw the football a couple of times, but truly special. He had some of the most catches by any player in Big Ten history, I believe, with 104 total catches, 1,233 yards, 13 combined touchdowns, including a lot of them rushing, and one receiving and one throwing touchdown. I mean, truly a hybrid player who a lot of people are going to have fun with in the NFL, in their offense, should they draft him. So, ultimately rounds off a pretty stellar offense for ESPN's All-America team for the 2024 college football season. Is a bittersweet moment in time because the college football season is coming to a close and we're not going to be able to get to talk about it as much. But for what it's worth, it truly was an incredible time. I love talking about it with you guys. Hey, we're going to talk a little bit about it, let it linger for a little while longer next week, but that will just about do it for this segment. Coming up next, we do our only hockey segment of today's show, breaking it up a little bit, talking about some power rankings, which teams are looking like true Stanley Cup contenders at the midway point of the season, right after this short break.
For the best and latest podcasts available anywhere, go to the podcast app on your cell phone and type in GSMC to access free content-rich podcasts on health and wellness, book reviews, sports, entertainment, relationships, social media, movies, technology, finance, and even weird news. Subscribe and download the GSMC Podcast Network's family of shows, available everywhere podcasts.
Hello everyone and welcome back into the GSMC Dead Ball Sports Podcast, and for our fourth segment of today's show, why not break up the monotony of talking all things football with a little bit of hockey, doing my first ever NHL Power Rankings. Now a lot of you might disagree with me, and granted I haven't watched a lot of hockey this season, hockey being one of the sports that I really love watching but haven't been able to keep as much up to date as I really want to, and it might reflect in my power rankings, but still I think it's a pretty comprehensive top 5. I think all of these teams are in the reckoning to compete for the Stanley Cup, both in the Eastern Conference and the Western Conference, of course, but I do think that a lot of you might be a little bit skeptical about my list, and you're free to comment on it if you're an NHL hardcore fan, but ultimately I'm just going to go with the flow here. Talk about what I know, talk about the players that I like to see moving forward for each of these teams. Without further ado, let's jump right into it. Starting off with the number 5 spot, and this is a spot that is kind of difficult to assess because a lot of teams in and around the top 5 to 10 of the rankings have had weird, rough stretches. But the Colorado Avalanche certainly have had some weird stretches. They've only won 2 of their last 5, I believe. But they truly are, with all the players they have in their core, a Stanley Cup contender on their day. They still have one of the best overall players in the NHL, one of the strongest centers you could possibly have in Nathan MacKinnon, in Cale Makar, one of the best young defensemen, and the unsung hero in net, Mackenzie Blackwood, of all goalies, after a really weird time as a New Jersey Devil, finding new life and rejuvenation to his NHL career in Colorado. And ultimately, yes, they find themselves in weird positioning in the Western Conference. I believe they're 4th in the Atlantic Division, I want to say. I might get some of these divisions in the conferences mixed up. No, actually, the Central and the West. But ultimately, I do think that Colorado still is going to be in the reckoning come postseason time to win it all. And yes, the West's going to be tough. A lot of teams that already are some of the most talented in the league are there. The Knights come to mind, the Oilers, and some teams who are having surprising seasons, like the Jets and the Wild, who we're going to talk about throughout the weeks. But the Avalanche are right in the mix just because of who they have and how they really rejuvenated certain players' career. And to say that they're a Stanley Cup contender with a guy like Mackenzie Blackwood between the pipes really says something about their standing. So at number 5, they sit on my personal list. You are free to comment about this if you have any qualms with it, but I still think, when I think about the Western Conference, the NHL in terms of Stanley Cup contenders, the Colorado Avalanche come to my mind. Then at number 4, let's talk about the surprising Winnipeg Jets. And I think a staff member here, GSMC, our good article writer and buddy Matt, put it best about this Winnipeg Jets team. And Anthony Manzano says, honestly, I've been saying this as a Panthers fan. I don't think Florida's taking the regular season that seriously, and we're going to kick it up in the playoffs. That's a nice shout, Mr. Manzano. I think that Florida is built for the postseason just because of how well-rounded they are. They proved it as such last year in their Stanley Cup victory. So you might be right in that regard. I haven't necessarily checked the standing as much in terms of teams that are fighting for playoff positioning. They currently are second, though, in the Atlantic. But I do think that you're right in that this is a team more well-built to have sustained postseason success rather than put all their energy in the regular season, because they truly rely on the collective whole rather than some teams who rely on individuality to get them to that point. So I agree that Florida are going to be a sneaky team in the Stanley Cup contender status. But in terms of power rankings and how teams are shaking out and how you feel about certain teams any given week, it's going to be interesting to see how this ranking gets updated. But then in terms of the Jets, they've had a weird stretch. They're 4-4-2. And Anthony Manzano said, for me, Edmonton is more of a regular season team. They don't have a great defense. Am I being harsh? Well, as an Edmonton fan, I would have to say you are being a little bit harsh. But I do think that Edmonton, in the regular season, start off slow, then ramp it up. So they are kind of a weird team to assess. We'll talk about them in these rankings a little bit later. But ultimately, you're not necessarily wrong in terms of what they need to improve to ultimately be taken seriously as cup contenders. Their defense needs to have sustained success. And while they actually did play well in last year's postseason, really well, they ultimately fell flat in certain moments in that Stanley Cup final when Florida got out to that big lead. So I do think that your analysis of Edmonton is semi-right, but I wouldn't say they're just a regular season team. They have proven in moments they can get down nitty-gritty in a playoff series and really take it to certain teams, but I really want to see, like you said, this defense shore up a little bit more come postseason time, because I know what they're capable of doing. I think that ultimately you're saying that getting to the Stanley Cup last year, getting out physical by Florida is partly true, but they did kind of ramp it up a little bit in the subsequent 3 games that they did win. So I'm not necessarily certain of what we're going to get out of Edmonton. And then Slashbill ultimately says Dallas can't be slept on as well, and I agree there. These are 2 teams that are not currently in my rankings. I feel like, you know, they are a team that when they get to the postseason, a lot of questions are asked about them, and I think this year they can answer them. Very talented team at all 3 levels of the ice. So I'm excited to talk about them a bit more. And while I do think that you guys are ultimately talking bad about the Oilers, you can't necessarily sleep on them. But let's talk about these Winnipeg Jets, because I feel like I can't let them go under the radar any longer here. I feel like Winnipeg, in the words of Matt, who is our article writer here at GSMC, are the San Antonio Spurs, the Greg Popovich era of the NHL. They quietly go about their business, and at the end of the day, you're going to have to reckon for them in the postseason if you're a Western Conference team. They had a rough stretch, like I said. They're 4-4-2 in these last couple of games, but as long as Connor Hellebuck is playing well between the pipes, one of the fastest goalies ever to 300 wins, I feel like they have a chance. As Anthony has a question about Stanley Cup last year, did you agree that Leon got away with a cheap shot of Barkov, and just because Alexander was on the Panthers, they treated him differently? I don't necessarily think that hit really got as much attention, because I feel like it happened in a weird moment. If I remember correctly, it was one of the games that Florida did end up losing. But I do think that, you know, Edmonton didn't necessarily play dirty all the time, right? They ultimately realized that they were going to have to play a different way to stay in that Stanley Cup, but really I feel like it was more about how Knoblauch adjusted the lines rather than any one big moment really altering the status of the Stanley Cup. I still thought that the Panthers were going to win, even though they came back, just because they were the more well-rounded, better team. But I do think that you have to account for Chris Knoblauch's decision-making at that point in the series. And I do think that that hit gets treated a little bit differently, but I don't necessarily think it will impact. But we are losing a little bit of track here. I have to quickly go through these top three, talking about the Oilers. The Oilers right now in a weird spot. McDavid's awaiting the suspension. Speaking of physical play from them, they've had a rough couple of games. But ultimately, I think that when you have the line of Draisaitl, Hyman, Connor McDavid firing on all cylinders that they have been in the past couple of weeks, I do think that they can get going. They just need to trust the core they have potentially outside of McDavid and Draisaitl to really get them to the highest heights. And then ultimately we can truly say that they are the ultimate Stanley Cup contender. But right now I can't see it. And then number 2, Vegas, and I promise we'll get to your comments. I just want to quickly get to all the teams in my rankings, Anthony, before we head to break. Golden Knights, obviously, they're also in a weird stretch of time. I believe they're currently on a 5-game losing streak. But the Knights are a team that I feel like don't necessarily get respected for how well-rounded they play throughout an NHL season. Obviously, the West is getting a little bit more loaded and top-heavy, but I do think the Knights are going to be there. And at the end of the day, you have, much like the Florida Panthers in the East, a very well-rounded team there, starting at the top with Jack Eichel, one of the top point scorers in the NHL, all the way down to a guy like Shea Theodore, and then Adin Hill playing out of his mind in net. And then last but not least, let's talk about the Washington Capitals at number 1 in my power rankings. Alex Ovechkin turning back the clock, second player in NHL history to score 20 goals in 20 straight seasons. But let's talk about the back end as well. Tom Wilson, John Carlson, 2 aging defensemen who are still giving it their all. Jakob Chychrun, one of the best offseason additions, and ultimately looking like the team to beat in the East. But before we head to break, I do want to address all of Anthony's comments. But a lot of people, even Edmonton fans I talked to, say that Edmonton got away with it because it was a Panthers player, specifically Kachuk, that did it to Leon O'Connor. Matt would have gotten suspended the rest of the series. Because it was Leon, he got away with that hit on Alex, because Alex is a superstar to Vegas, and Edmonton had to make any big trades on defense to improve it before the deadline or the All-Star break. I think all are great statements. I agree that because Florida are seen as a team that have superstars but don't rely on them like Edmonton's, why that hit rubbed Panthers fans the wrong way. But I do think that at the end of the day, I think that ultimately you can't necessarily look too much into that hit because of the fact that I don't necessarily think it really altered the series too much in Edmonton's favor, outside of the fact they really got back into that series because Florida was winning that 7th game no matter what. I think Edmonton was too gassed to win that. And then, in terms of what Vegas and Edmonton have to do, I don't think they have to change anything. They are teams in the West who have been doing this for the past couple of years, and I wouldn't be surprised if one of them makes a big move, but I think they're settled with how they are. They just need a lot of these players to click. They need to rely on their core to carry them forward. So I'm not necessarily certain they do make any big moves. And then last but not least, am I surprised about Washington? I feel like Washington are a team that a lot of people weren't expecting to see rebuild this quickly, but that Jakob Chychrun addition in their defense really bolstered it. And I don't necessarily think that they would be in rebuild mode at the deadline bad, but I didn't necessarily think they would be top of the Eastern Conference standings good either. So I really am surprised. But thank you all for your comments. We have to get on to the next final segment of today's show, talking about the Jets hiring Aaron Glenn as their new head coordinator. The Lions now down 2 of their top minds in their coaching staff. We'll be talking about that as well after this short break. Hello everyone and welcome back into the GSMC Dead Ball Sports Podcast, and for our final segment of today's show, we're talking about the shocking news coming from the Jets camp that they are hiring Aaron Glenn as their 21st head coach. But it really isn't shocking in my opinion. I think this is a great hire for the Jets first and foremost, especially on the defensive side of the football. Has a lot of weapons to utilize in that regard, but it certainly comes with its caveats. Obviously, the ownership, really a mess. The quarterback situation, an even bigger mess. And ultimately, hiring another defensive-minded coach could rub a lot of Jets fans the wrong way if he doesn't get a couple things right. But I do think that this is the right guy for the job if you look at how potentially the Jets might want to build in terms of their philosophies, because I do think that their defensive unit is the way to build this team from the bottom up. So let's assess the impact this has on both the Jets and the Lions as well. But first, let's talk about how Aaron Glenn reunites with his former team. Yes, he was a former New York Jet. He was a first-round pick for them in 1994 out of Texas A&M. He spent 8 seasons with them, made 2 Pro Bowls, left them after those 8 seasons, had a prolific career as well. I believe it was a Houston Texan. I'm not necessarily certain where he went after New York, but was a former Jet, so this is interesting to see him reunite with his former team. Obviously, could have a lot of good relations within the front office there as well, but I truly do believe that looking at all the options the Jets had available to them and seeing as to how, they're taking advantage of the Lions' surprising loss in the divisional round, that this was the right move for them. Because before, with Saleh, he had built a reputation, but I'm not necessarily certain he was expecting, or the Jets were expecting, this whole Rodgers saga to play out like this. Now, Aaron Glenn is stepping into a situation where at least he knows how uncertain the quarterback position, the future of it is, and he can assess and analyze it from that perspective rather than Robert Saleh being getting tossed into the fire with Aaron Rodgers. So I do think this will have a very positive impact in terms of how a first-year head coach can analyze this rather than someone who's been there for as long as Robert Saleh was. But I do think that first and foremost, when we talk about Aaron Glenn, we have to talk about how he's revamping this defense. So, obviously, he spent many years as an assistant in NFL circles before he became the Lions defensive coordinator in 2021. But immediately, as soon as he came into the Lions situation, he implemented his physical man-to-man style, and they saw very quick results. The Lions had the second lowest completion percentage in his time there, lowest passer rating allowed in his time there as well. So as you can see, he got results out of a defense that was able to build through the draft, most importantly, which is a good thing considering that the Jets are going to have to answer a lot of questions through the draft this year as well. But ultimately, proving that a quick turnaround in terms of your philosophy could pay dividends for you. And so that's what's so exciting about Aaron Glenn implementing his ideas with this squad, especially with the players they have. You have Quinn Williams up front. You have Sauce Gardner and DJ Reed in your secondary. And then you have the 7th overall pick in this year's draft, where you could pick anyone that you need for this team that you want to build through your defense. But then again, the big question for Aaron Glenn is not what he's going to do with this defense, because I think he's going to do wonders for this defense. It's how he's going to hire his staff for the offense. It's how he's going to think about this draft pick in terms of whether or not he should go offense or defense. And most importantly, how he solves the QB situation that will have an impact on how the Jets improve. Because remember, the Jets were 4-13 with Aaron Rodgers. And yes, a lot of people will place a lot of blame on him. But look at his stats. He had very similar stats to his last season in Green Bay, where he had over 3,000 yards, he had over 25 touchdowns, and only 11 or so interceptions. So he didn't play terribly. But you still have to consider all the options. You have to consider Aaron Rodgers' status on this team and what he's feeling. It's a lot to navigate if you're a defensive-minded coach, and especially if you're a defensive-minded first-year head coach, as Aaron Glenn is. But I do think that when we look at all the questions that are going to be asked of Aaron Glenn, I do think that the draft is going to answer a lot of them, because how he views the draft and how this Jets organization views the draft is going to be very, very intriguing, because at number 7 overall, you're not in line to get one of the top 2 quarterbacks, a couple stellar defensive players that you might want to look at will be off the board as well, and you're not necessarily in position to reach for a guy or take at best position of biggest need if you're the Jets. But obviously, they have very big questions offensively, more so than defensively, in my opinion. But when you look at all those mock drafts, it is a weird pick to determine, just because you also have a lot of defensive players who could really supplement what Aaron Glenn wants to do. You have a lot of nice safeties. Malachi Starks could be an option, but he could be seen as a reach. Nick Emenwari could be a bit of a reach, but he could be someone who's nice in terms of the coverage that Aaron Glenn wants to employ. But when I think about the ways you can answer this question, if you're Aaron Glenn and people are asking you about what are you going to do with this draft pick that's in a weird spot, say you're going to pick offense, because offense is where you also need to build from. And one of the biggest question marks for the Jets heading into this offseason is how they're going to address this offensive line. They have a lot of nice pieces in place. They signed Moses and Tyron Smith in the offseason. Didn't play terribly well, but still nice tackles to have. They drafted Olu Fashanu, who I actually think had a pretty decent season for what he was given with the situation he was put into. And then you have an offensive line class that's pretty deep at the top. You potentially have your pick of 2 of the best tackles in the class in Will Campbell and Kelvin Banks, and you would answer a lot of questions in terms of how you rebuild this offense by drafting one of them. So if I'm Aaron Glenn, I have in the back of my mind some guys I want at the defensive positions that I might want to look into a little bit more and bolster. But I also have in the back of my mind how to rebuild this offense, and furthermore, entrust in my team, instill in my team the confidence that it can be rebuilt, especially if Aaron Rodgers decides to return. If not, then I do think that it's going to be interesting to see the latter stages of the draft for the Jets. Because if, say, Aaron Rodgers does leave, it leaves you with a pretty weird, complicated spot. Because if you're drafting a quarterback in the latter stages of the draft, you're definitely not going to get a day 1 starter, in my opinion. You're not going to get a day 1 starter out of Quinn Ewers, Dylan Gabriel, Jackson Dart, what have you. I feel like you might want to, with your first overall pick, deliver a statement of intent for this offense and drafting either Banks or Campbell if they're still there, or one of the other good tackles in this class. But I do think that in order to really hammer home the fact that Aaron Rodgers could be seen as a bridge starter, and then you develop a guy like Ewers, Gabriel, Darter, what have you, after you draft them, you need to ensure that your 7th overall pick is a good one for Rodgers at the very least. Because that's what I think Rodgers wants from that 7th overall pick. He wants a bookend tackle who he can rely on to protect him. He wants to build this offense. But this decision to hire Aaron Glenn puts that draft pick in question, in my opinion, just because of how he could build this defense. And looking at this defense, it would be nice to have a running partner on the edge for a guy like Quinnen Williams, so he's not going to have to really make hay through the interior. And then on the back end, you have good corners, but you might want a safety who can do well in run support, do well in man-to-man once Aaron Glenn employs that system. So it's going to be an interesting ride to see how the Jets handle this offseason. Ultimately, seeing as to how Aaron Glenn is someone who can get immediate success out of his teams, I wouldn't be too worried if I'm a Jets fan about how he views the draft, because either way, whether it's offense or defense, you know it's a good building block for the future, because if it's offense, it proves that Aaron Glenn's not going to overlook that side of the football. And if it's defense, you know that it's only going to get even better than it already is. So, no matter what happens this offseason with the Jets, no matter what rumors arise, I think they're in a better spot now that Aaron Glenn's their head coach rather than anyone else, because he has a chance to firmly assess this team and where they are and then make decisions. And that's something that can't be said for a lot of these Jets coaches who are thrown into the fire. And the fact that he was a former Jet really gives him that level of respect potentially in the locker room as well. So I think that it's at least in the A to B tier higher in terms of how I would grade it out, just because of what I think he can do with this defense. It's going to be really fun to see what he does. But ultimately, you can't go wrong with someone who's a former Jet and who got immediate success in his biggest role with this team. But ultimately, that will just about do it for today's show. This has been the GSMC Dead Ball Sports Podcast, brought to you as always by the GSMC Sports Network. I've been your host, Christopher Shepard. Thank you all for tuning in. We'll be back tomorrow, as always, at 3:30 p.m. Eastern Standard Time. Like, follow, and subscribe if you haven't done so already. Consider making yourselves available to, as always, the Super Chat, Super Things, and the Super Stickers features, and our website, gsmcpodcast.net. Contribute and interact with the show a little bit more directly. But other than that, I'm out for today. See y'all tomorrow to conclude the week.